Next thing I want to look at is a DBQ, because again, if you can write one and structure your paragraphs and structure your essay and create your arguments, you can also do that with a DBQ. So let's look at this one, because another component of time period 4 is the Second Great Awakening and the reform movements that come from that. So the First Great Awakening during the colonial period, again, it's about providing religious influence and that kind of thing. So did that religious influence create reform? And by reform, we're talking about social change. And the question type, again, is going to be causation. So we want to take the documents and we want to plan out, did religion cause the reforms that we're going to be seeing in the documents? Now, here in AP Daily Live, we're not going to be going through every single document and planning that out, because I want to show you that the way you write your essay, the reader of your essay should be able to understand the description of your document without actually seeing the document. That's how specific it needs to be. I'm going to show you an example. So these are the 7 documents that are listed from that particular question that was from an old DBQ question. So we would look through and we would see Lyman Beecher, and you may be remembering his name. He was one of the revivalist ministers from the Second Great Awakening. The Drunkard's Progress, A Direct Road to Poverty. This was actually a political cartoon, and it shows a guy who takes this first drink, and then he progressively gets more and more out of control in his life. So this would be referencing the temperance movement. Then David Walker, you might remember him as one of the abolitionists, his appeal for colored citizens of the world, very famous document that he wrote. Charles Grandison Finney, another one of the revivalist ministers, a Unitarian minister who is writing to Ralph Waldo Emerson about Brook Farm, his utopian community. Well, that's dealing with the transcendentalist. Dorothea Dix, she was talking about prison reform and that people who were mentally disabled shouldn't be put into a prison with criminals, that we should have separation, and that the criminals in the prisons should actually be reformed. So that should be penitentiary reform. And then Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Declaration of Sentiments, which she wrote with the other women at Seneca Falls. So we've got our documents here. It's a really interesting set of documents. And we would want to plan out how we would answer our question. All right. So again, we were looking at, did religion cause or have influence on the reform movements? Now, one thing that I want you to pay attention to is when you're looking at a DBQ, and my students tell me that one of the hardest things that they find is how you group the documents together. And what I tell them is that the documents are usually going to fit together in sets of 2, 2, and 3. So if the documents can fit together in sets of 2, 2, and 3, when you're looking at the documents, if you can start to pair them off, and then there's usually a document that might fit in a couple of places. Now, that means that the way you set up your essay may not be the same way that I set up my essay. It can be different because, again, this is your argument that you are building and that you are proving. So if I'm thinking of this as 2, 2, and 3, and I'm looking at this set of documents, I can immediately remember that these first two, right? A reformation of morals, practical and indispensable, a sermon. So even if I didn't remember that Lyman Beecher was a minister from the Second Great Awakening, with that term sermon, that might be a tip off there. Same thing with Charles Grandison Finney, a revival in religion. I'm probably going to be able to connect at least those two together. And then we've got a Unitarian minister. So we're going to put all 3 of those ministers together. And I'm going to say that this is creating broad social reform. They want people to be more moral, to not be caught up in the money and the greed from that market revolution. So that's going to put those documents together. Then I would try to see if I can put something else together. And I would probably find David Walker looking for equality for enslaved persons, and the women's movement. Those are similar, looking for equal rights. Not as connected to religion. It's somewhat connected to religion, the abolitionist movement and the women's movement, but it's not as tied to it as these first ones. And then that would leave people who are drunk, and then people who are in prison. So these are people who have already gone down a bad path that we want to bring them back and rehabilitate them. So that's looking at individual morality. So I hope that helps to see how you can kind of look at your list of 7 and see how they might pair together. All right, so once we've paired them together, then we need to go back to our question, plan it out, evaluate the extent to which religious ideas of the Second Great Awakening shaped reform movements of the first half of the 19th century. So we said it's a causation. Did it cause it or did it not? So I'm saying that this did have significant religious foundation, and I put those three documents together: broad social reform. Individual morality, I said that had some religious foundation, but not as much as the other one. And then equality. And so again, that's some religious reform, but not as much. So now that I've planned it out, I'm going to start looking at my contextualization. So what's leading us to need a great awakening and a reform and going back to religion? Well, it's probably because people are so caught up in making money in that market revolution and the industrialization. So that's what I would probably use for contextualization. You could use something different. Here was my thesis statement. While religious ideas from the Second Great Awakening had the greatest impact on broad social reform efforts to challenge the growing preoccupation with work and greed, religion also had some influence on new initiatives to promote individual morality and equality in the first half of the 19th century. I'm still not finished. Because remember, in a DBQ, you've got to put in outside information. So which one of these body paragraphs might I be able to add something additional that would help to prove my point? I would probably choose here, where I've got the equality reform and the growth of the abolition movement. I might bring in William Lloyd Garrison and the Liberator. All right. You could also bring in Sabbatarian reform. That's where they were beginning to talk about leaving Sunday, the Christian Sabbath, as a day of rest. And if nobody's working, then nobody's losing any money. So that was an effort that they were looking at. So what I want us to do is to go and score a body paragraph. That was something else that you all ask about in the Google form, is you want to actually see how do you use this in a paragraph. And so I want to show you a paragraph from this document-based question that I just created, and I wrote a paragraph, and we'll pick out describe, support, and sourcing. While I've got the document camera on, I also want to bring in a short answer question related to Andrew Jackson, because he's also part of this time period. So before we switch over there, let me remind you about the format for the SAQs. Again, we're going to show you this each and every one of our sessions because it's important to know what to expect on the digital versus the paper exam. So you're going to have the 3 short answer questions on the paper pencil exam. You're going to have the 3 different types of SAQs in the first section, but then you're having an additional section of short answer questions on the digital one. What we're focusing on today is this type of question that both of you will have, regardless of which format you're taking the test. It's a primary source image, and this one is a political cartoon. All right, and then the second set of questions if you are in the digital format. All right, so let me switch over to show you some sample answers that I want us to score together. And I'm going to color code it. All right, so why don't we start with the DBQ, because that's where we were to begin with. All right, so if we look at, and I'll leave that over there. Okay, so if we started with our context and our thesis, when I score this sometimes with my students and we start practicing, I begin to look at color coding and finding ways to give credit in our essays. And so this is something that you can do yourself. You know, if you want to practice on your own, there are all kinds of practice prompts that you can locate in AP Classroom and in other places. Write out your essay and then go back and score it yourself and see if if you can pinpoint that in your own writing, or email a friend or something like that. So in our introductory paragraph, we're going to have our context and our thesis. So I'm not going to write out the context because we've already talked about that, but our thesis is the same one. This is the same one that we had before. So I'm not going to highlight the whole thing, but I'm putting that there for a purpose. And notice here that I'm color coding my thesis the same color that I color code support when I find it in the body paragraph, because your support is supposed to be explaining how or why the document proves what you're claiming from the thesis. All right, so then we would have body paragraph number 1, which was the broad social reform efforts, and body paragraph number 2, the new initiatives to promote individual morality. I'm going to write body paragraph number 3 because that's where I also want to work in that outside information, and I want to show you how that fits in as well. All right, so if we are looking at using a document, well, the first thing that I want to do is I want to have my topic sentence. We talked about that with the LEQ, that you need to have a topic sentence. So here's my introductory paragraph. Then I would have had body paragraph 1, body paragraph 2. So this is the start of body paragraph number 3. Religious ideas from the Second Great Awakening also had some effect on the growing efforts to achieve equality for various groups in the early 1800s, because I'm going to be bringing in abolitionists and women. Okay, so that's my topic sentence. That's what I'm trying to prove, that religion was part of it, but not the whole part of it. So I'm going to use document number 3. Now, you've not read document number 3, and I did that on purpose because from my description, you should be able to understand what is happening in the document. So I've got my topic sentence. I need to identify what the document is. So it was David Walker's 1829 Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. Emphasized that there was really no such thing as freedom for Black Americans because they were subject to capture and possible re-enslavement by white Southerners. Walker also emphasized white Christians as being guilty of unfair treatment. So he purposely calls out white Christians as being guilty of re-enslaving free Blacks. So here is my description. I've told what the document was, and then I've given the main idea. So this would meet the criteria for description. The other thing you want to do, just as formatting to make it easy for the AP reader, identify the document number down here. So just right at the end, just in parentheses, document 3. All right, so now I've got to prove that this was part of the thesis. So I had that in pink up here. I'm going to have this in pink down here. This warning shows how religious ideas had some influence on Walker's efforts to promote the abolition movement because I always tell my students, this is that key word. This shows what? It shows that religion had an influence on abolition, but how or why does it show it? You've got to prove it to me. Just because you say it doesn't mean it's true. You've got to prove it, because he emphasized white Christians who were influenced by and participated in revival movements of the Second Great Awakening as being key oppressors. That's why it's connected, at least somewhat. All right, then with sourcing. So our sourcing, you did that in session 2 with Mr. Pulaski. He calls it happy, where you pick out one of the sourcing elements and explain how or why it ties to your thesis. So I'm going to use purpose. One purpose, and I'm just going to be obvious. I'm going to tell the reader what I'm doing. The audience, the purpose, the point of view is the purpose of Walker's statement was to expose how slavery and the unfair treatment of free Blacks represented unchristian behavior. But he doesn't want to just expose it. He wants an action and to encourage more participation in the abolition reform movement. So here's my use of a document. Here's what I'm trying to prove. Here's my description of the document. Here's how I've supported the thesis statement with it, and there's my sourcing. In that same body paragraph, I'm going to use outside information. So with outside information, this is the additional piece. We said we were going to use William Lloyd Garrison. So I always like to start it as another example of how religious ideas of the Second Great Awakening influenced equality reform in at least a limited way was William Lloyd Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Society. But I can't just name drop. I've got to define what that is. I've got to show that I know what I'm talking about. So the American Anti-Slavery Society promoted abolition through speeches by prominent leaders in the movement and publications. Chapters of the American Anti-Slavery Society in northern cities were often linked to churches and drew on their ideas and membership. Why would I need to put this statement in? This is explaining how or why my example proves my thesis. It all goes back to what I'm trying to prove in that paragraph. All right. So then I hope that helps with the DBQ. And again, you can write it a different way. You can use different elements of sourcing. You can use different pieces of outside evidence.